Gun issues in Chicago remain in the national spotlight following a recent announcement that the U.S. Supreme Court will hear a challenge to the city's handgun ban, which was implemented in 1982 to combat urban crime. Mayor Daley has predicted Wild West shootouts should the court rule that the ban is unconstitutional. Richard Pearson, director of the Illinois State Rifle Association, said, "We want to overturn this ban. It's pretty onerous. It takes the right of self-defense away from every Chicago citizen." I'm Professor Connie Mixon, and we explore this controversial issue on this episode of The Professors.
From across the city and the 7 city colleges of Chicago, broadcasting from 63rd and Halsted at Kennedy King College. Professors take the art of conversation to a higher degree.
In the 2008 case of District of Columbia versus Heller, a 5-4 Supreme Court ruling struck down a ban on handguns in Washington, D.C. The court ruled that the District of Columbia's 32-year-old ban was incompatible with gun rights under the Second Amendment. As expected, strong reaction has been pouring in on both sides of this emotional issue. Gun control advocates like Chicago Mayor Richard M. Daley were outraged, while gun rights activists are currently trying to overturn a similar ban in Chicago. The Heller decision went further than even the Bush administration wanted, and while it leaves most gun laws intact, it could provide the precedent needed to invalidate Chicago's handgun ban. The Illinois State Rifle Association began the court fight to get Chicago's ban overturned. To discuss this controversial issue are Professors Cranston Knight from Malcolm X College, Ted Williams from Kennedy King College, award-winning journalist Jorge Medeiros, and Mike Weisman, Vice President of the Illinois State Rifle Association. Welcome all.
Thank you.
Mike, can you get us started and maybe tell us a little bit about why the Illinois Rifle Association is behind this ban?
Sure. I'm Mike Weisman from the Illinois State Rifle Association. I'm the first vice president. And we started looking at opportunities when we knew that the Heller case was in front of the Supreme Court. And we have a case put together with the Second Amendment Foundation as a plaintiff, the Illinois State Rifle Association as a plaintiff, and then we have 4 living people as plaintiffs that are residents of the city of Chicago and Illinois State Rifle Association members. And we have a 73-year-old man from the south side of Chicago who's a leader in his neighborhood. He led the fight to integrate his union in the workplace, and he's a community activist. And then we have a husband and wife team that live on the north side. He's a computer scientist. She's a hypnotherapist, and then we have an ex-policeman turned commodities trader.
And the argument is that Chicago has a similar ban, and ours should be overturned as well?
Exactly.
And from what I understand about the argument, it is based on the idea that if people who break into homes know that the people who are in the homes might possibly have a handgun, this is what the lawyer for the Heller case, who's now arguing the case, is arguing essentially that people are going to then think twice before they break into someone's home. But the logic to me is slightly flawed, because as it stands today, you could have, per se, a shotgun in your home in Chicago, which I know plenty of people who do. And the argument could very well be the same, that if someone broke into someone's house today, you would not know whether they had a shotgun or a rifle in their home. So consequently, the idea that criminals are going to think twice before they break into someone's home because we get rid of the handgun ban, I don't necessarily think is a consistent, logical argument to me.
Rifles are undesirable for home defense, especially in a crowded urban area.
But we can talk about shotguns.
And shotguns are undesirable.
Why?
For defense in a home, especially in a small home in an urban area, because your movement is restricted.
Yeah, Mike, I think it's interesting that you said that there's different laws in different states regulating guns. Wouldn't that lead to the argument that Chicago should be able to set its own rules and laws regarding guns?
Well, and that's the way it has been, and that's a way that is a way that you could look at it in the past when the establishment of the civil right of gun ownership was not solidified by the Supreme Court. But now the Supreme Court has said this is a civil right. This is a fundamental civil right.
Yeah, but
For
wait a second.
So what we're going to see in the next 20 years, we're going to see watershed. We're going to see stepping stone of legislation.
Well, let me say this though, but by arguing that it was a civil or individual right was the conversation.
As opposed to a militia.
Even Justice Scalia made the case that this did not then consequently overturn every local restriction on handguns. And the argument actually, because you mentioned the argument of common usage, and so that handguns would be, because they're commonly used, they would be considered sort of more permissible than, say, a machine gun, for instance, in your house, because by the Second Amendment, you could make the argument that if it's my right to carry a weapon, then I should be able to have a machine gun. Well, the common use argument, Justice Breyer argued, fundamentally was flawed because of that point. Because if people begin to use machine guns, and that's sort of what's commonly used, then you could make the case that restricting machine guns in the home is a violation of the Constitution as well. And so it's a slippery slope in the logic, and I think, once again, and let me say this, I don't necessarily, and this is where I fully agree with you on this, I don't necessarily think that gun control works all that well in this country. I think the inconsistency from state to state makes it so that it's really a joke. Because if I buy a weapon in Indiana, there are no metal detectors on the border to go to Illinois to stop me anyway. But I think when you think about Chicago, living in Chicago, the idea that there will be more people carrying weapons in the city than less people does not necessarily make me all that comfortable, and let's just be real about it.
How's it working out now?
Well, Chicago's not a safe city.
It's not.
I mean, it's not.
It's not. We talk.
No.
The mayor
I'm
talks
not
about
sure
the
guns
Wild
make
Wild
it
West.
safer.
No.
The mayor talks about the Wild Wild West.
Already.
The Wild West was safer than what we've got in Chicago now, and taking the individual citizens that aren't out there committing crimes and putting prior restraint on them so that they can't defend themselves, that's not necessarily making things any better.
If I'm in a home and you break into my home, you already got your weapon. You've already got your weapon at hand. I've got to then, if I've got it in the lockbox, then I've got to go to the box if I'm that type of owner who placed it in a safe. If I've got another type of weapon that's not there but it's easy to access, I've got to then go to the weapon, which is time. You're coming up the steps. I've got to try to find the weapon. We're talking about shootout.
You're creating a scenario.
It is, and in fact, if I'm going to break into your home while you're there, and that's what you're saying, so that I'm defending my home against you entering my home, then what's happening inside my home as you're walking in, right? So you're breaking into my home. I may not have a detector, which alarm goes off. I hear you. You're coming up the steps. Your weapon's already drawn. So then, what's the point
if
of
somebody's
having?
breaking into my home, they're breaking into my home.
Correct.
And it's up to me to defend myself.
Right. And if you can't get to the weapon,
I can call the police, and it's
if
going
you
to
can
take
get to the phone,
it's going to take them some time.
we're assuming you can get to the phone. This person's already coming up the steps, or if you live in that type of dwelling.
I mean, I think, we could have this conversation all day, and I think it's an important one, but at the end of the day, I think what's most important about this conversation is the question whether the states have the right to restrict the gun ownership. And there has been plenty of court precedent to suggest that there are those rights. I mean, you can't have a gun if you're a felon. You can't have a gun if you're considered mentally ill. You can't have a gun for a variety of other reasons. So to suggest that in some way restricting them to particular geographic areas is a violation of a fundamental right, I think once again does not make sense.
Jorge, can you tell us a little bit about, you've served as a foreign correspondent.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how we compare to other countries and some of your experiences.
So how it works outside, especially in Brazil now is in the news because Brazil, Rio de Janeiro got the Olympics. So now we're going to follow every day what's going on in Rio. Well, I had that experience in Rio. I lived there for 7 years working as a journalist, covering these shootouts between gangsters. They recently shot down a helicopter because they have the power, they have the weapons, and those guys, the bad guys, they got the weapons from sources outside the country because inside the country is control. You cannot have more than a 22 caliber, maybe a 32 caliber.